Welcome to Pod Talks. Pod Talks is a project of protecting our democracy, where we bring together the best minds in New Jersey and beyond to talk about some of the biggest challenges facing our democracy, our institutions, and our personal freedoms. I'm Sean Spiller, Chair of Protecting Our Democracy. Today, I'm truly honored to welcome Dr. DeForest B. Soaries, Jr., who, as many of you know, is known as Buster Soaries. Thank you so much, Doctor, for joining us. I appreciate that. I'm truly looking forward to our conversation today.
Well, Mayor, it's an honor to meet you and an honor to be with you on this so important subject.
Yeah, thank you so much. And before we begin, just a little bit about you for those who are not as familiar with your impressive career. And certainly, I'm going to note this is just a few of the highlights because you've had such an esteemed career, but just really a little flavor of the great many things you've done in helping our community and certainly helping the state of New Jersey. Dr. Soaries' career includes as a faith leader, a business leader, a government official with a focus on lifting up individual communities, especially ones that are all too often left behind. In all that he's done, we see consistent themes of faith, educational excellence, and economic opportunity, all woven together in all of his endeavors. With over 30 years of ministry experience as senior pastor of First Baptist Church in Lincoln Gardens, Dr. Soaries set the standard for bringing people into the church and building a faith-centered community. Under his leadership at First Baptist, the congregation grew both in numbers and engagement. And certainly we all know that's in the backdrop of a time when there's been a decline in participation in houses of worship. Currently, as president and CEO of the Corporate Community Connections Incorporated, Dr. Soaries works with corporations and organizations to enhance social responsibility and create positive impact on the community. And again, this is just one of the organizations that Dr. Soaries has founded to create pathways for economic opportunity and community development. Another project that I'm sure we want to talk a little bit about was founded and launched by Dr. Soaries in 2005, which was the D-Free Financial Freedom Movement, which focuses on helping people build financially self-sufficient incomes and support. From January 1999 to January 2002, Dr. Soaries served as the Secretary of State in New Jersey in the Christine Todd Whitman administration, making him the first African-American male to do so. In 2003, he was appointed to the Federal Election Assistance Commission, which was established by Congress to implement the Help America Vote Act of 2002, and he served as chairman. Dr. Soaries has authored 12 books. He serves on numerous boards. He earned his bachelor's degree from Fordham University, a master's of divinity degree from Princeton Theological Seminary, and a doctor of ministry degree from United Theological Seminary. Again, Dr. Soaries, thank you for spending the time with us today, and certainly there's a lot to discuss, and you're the person we want to talk to today, so thanks again.
Lord, you had everything except my shoe size.
Listen, we'll get to that in the closing, right? But for now, I want to jump right in because, you know, as we spoke a little bit there about your wide-ranging career, certainly as a faith leader, your service to government, and thank you on all fronts for sure. I guess I'm going to jump right in with one of the big questions, and that would really be, what's your perspective on where we are today, right? When you look at our country, when you see the state of our democracy, if you will, you know, a lot of people, are talking about, hey, democracy's on the ballot this November. Is that overstating things? How do you view this context from what you've seen over your years of service?
Well, thanks for the question. And again, thanks for having me. I think the reason I wanted to come to your podcast today is because of the state of things today. Very broadly, I describe the core of our crisis as relates to democracy as being that we've turned our democracy over to partisan politics. Now, I understand partisan politics. I've been a participant in partisan politics. But what I mean is this: if, for instance, if the only entities that are really interested in promoting voting, which is foundational democracy, are the people who run campaigns, then what happens is there becomes a de facto kind of voter suppression, because the goal of a campaign is not to get everyone to vote, but to get the most votes for your candidate. And so I think the overlay for democracy is to have a public, a governmental, and then non-governmental, nonpartisan participation in promoting voting, in voter education, voter registration. You know, Sean, I started my adult life and my activist career on Chestnut Street in Montclair. There was a lady who lived right up the street from my high school who was a PTA activist and decided to get involved in politics. And at 16 years old, my first community engagement was working on her voter registration drive. She became the first woman and the first African American woman elected to the Board of Freeholders at that time, which is now the Board of Commissioners. She became the first Black woman elected to the state legislature, the first woman elected to the Senate, and her name was Winona Lippman. And at that time, we were active in getting people to participate even before we were active in getting people to vote for her. So I think what we have to do is decide as a nation that not only is there room for campaigns, and I'm for campaigns. I mean, you ran a very effective campaign in Montclair, but in addition to the campaign, there have to be voices. There's got to be platforms, and there's got to be resources put into voter education, helping people have access to voting, which we'll talk about, I'm sure, and ensuring that voter participation is as high as it could possibly be to protect not only the principles of democracy, but the practices of democracy.
Where do you see, there have been organizations, whether you think of League of Women Voters, a number of other community organizations that are constantly working to engage people in the process, right? Get people to register to vote, certainly engage around civics in general. Have you seen a change, though? Obviously, as you noted, right, you participated in partisan politics, and there are elections that have happened, since the beginning of this country. But what's changed? I guess why do we see maybe a falling off of what you're describing? And then maybe that'll help guide us as to how we turn that back in the right direction potentially.
There are two things that have changed, Sean. Thing number one is the influence of money in politics, both local, state, and federal. But the second thing that's changed is the science of political campaigns. And by that, I mean, back in the old days, if you ran for any office, the structure of the campaign was designed to reach out to all of the voters of a particular area and hope your message resonated with enough voters to win an election. Today, the science of campaigns suggests that you hire people who look for the people most likely to vote for you. And the research that's done is really to identify the voters who voted in primaries, the voters who voted a particular way. And now big data can look at people's buying patterns, where people shop, what people wear, what people drive. And so the science of campaigns focuses on producing the most votes and at times doing it in such a way that you literally discourage people who are not likely to vote for your candidate. And that is what I call de facto voter suppression. So if you put the money in first place that it costs to do that kind of science, and then the practice, what you end up having is politics that are completely different than they were 50 years ago.
How do you see us changing that? I mean, we've got Citizens United. We know that the money is coming in and going to flow into politics. That money is often directed, at candidates and campaigns because, obviously, whether more benign or more malicious, people have their goals and intentions and candidates that they support. But that dollar goes there, right, to make sure that candidate wins and brings forward those interests. How do you see the dollars flowing, to your point, that it would take to get out more voters, to do the work you're talking about when the money is going in a specific direction?
Yeah, I think there's a role for government here. I'm not one who believes government can solve all problems and that money can solve all problems. But I do think that government, federal government, state government, local government, should play a greater role in elections administration, and voting. Give you some examples. When I was chair of the Elections Commission in Washington, what we did was create. We used media partners to do this. We created a hotline for people leading up to the 2004 presidential election. The number one question that was asked all over the country was, where do I vote? Where is my polling place? Where is my polling place? Which means that government, I believe, has both a responsibility and a vested interest in helping people know where to go to vote. Another example is uh, something I talked about a lot, and that is vote. We vote now in many districts in early voting. Not every district has early voting, but early voting has expanded access to the polling places because when Tuesday is election day, people have to work on Tuesday. People have other issues on Tuesday. Um, a lot of people are left out of the voting process if Tuesday is election day. So early voting has helped, but I still think it would help if election day were on Saturday, for instance, even with early voting, because the majority of the people still vote on election day. And election day is a part of our culture, election day is a part of our narrative. And changing election day from, particularly in federal elections, from Tuesday to Saturday would help. Poll workers, we are running out of people who will work the polls on election day. Uh, Traditionally, most poll workers are older, and as the technologies have changed and the ages of the poll workers have changed, there's a gap between the ability of the people who are typically the poll volunteers, poll judges in some districts, and the technologies that they have to manage to administer elections. We don't have sufficient training for election administrators. And so there are probably two or three colleges in the country that offer even certificates, much less degrees, in elections administration. So there's so much we can do that, by the way, Eastern European countries are doing, Mexico is doing. There's so many places that the government actually invests in the infrastructure of voting, which I believe demonstrates a commitment to democracy.
Well, let's talk about that a little bit because you mentioned, your work at the Election Assistance Commission and certainly Help America Vote Act, which I mentioned in the intro, which the goal is, increase more people's participation and voting in that. How does that juxtaposition work when we see, quite frankly, more than ever, people questioning elections, questioning the authenticity of outcomes? That's some people in pretty vocal places, big Billy pulpits, if you will, with the opportunity to kind of make those claims. How is that, I guess, countered the work? What would maybe tell us a little bit about the commission and what came out of that? What are some of the other suggestions? I know you just offered your thoughts on a few things, but what really came out of that work? Where do you see that? And maybe then I'll ask in how do you contrast that to what we're hearing, nationally now from some of the candidates in terms of trust in elections?
Wow, how much time do you have today? Uh, the U.S. Election Assistance Commission was formed by Congress in response to the 2000 presidential election debacle, where in Florida specifically, because of the voting technologies they used these cards, and you punched a hole in the card, and it was such a close race that whether or not a person really intended to make a particular choice was determined by how deep the hole went in the card, and the hanging chad became a national
Oh
symbol.
yeah, I remember those videos, right? Holding them up and everyone
That's
looking.
right.
Sure, yeah.
So, and then ultimately the Supreme Court had to make a decision on when the voting would stop, and that caused George W. Bush to become president and not Al Gore. So, Congress gets together, and I think the publicity surrounding the voting technology and the inadequacies of that technology embarrassed both parties, and there was a bipartisan consensus that we had to do something about it. And so, 2 years later, the Help America Vote Act was passed, and the core of that was to give money to every state to buy new voting machines. And it was $3.2 billion to buy new voting equipment. I can't go deeply into it because you don't have enough time. It was also, however, in that act, the responsibility of the commission, which would oversee the disbursement of the funds and the other work of the commission, to do research to determine what kind of machines would be the preferred kinds of machines. The big debate at that time, and one of our own congressman from New Jersey, Rush Holt, was one of the leaders of this debate, was should we use machines that cannot verify the electronic vote that was cast, or should we require machines that had a paper verification to protect us from any kind of technology shenanigans. Well, the long and short is that the ultimate uh, accomplishment prior to 2004 was to disperse the money. And unfortunately, Sean, we dispersed the $3.2 billion before we did the research. And so even today, there was no prototype established by research that would say this is the best kind of machine. I mean, we have prototypes for toasters, we have prototypes for flat screen TVs, we have prototypes
Yeah.
for all kinds of technology. We have better security for slot machines and casinos than we do for voting equipment. So let's fast forward to today. What happened in 2020 was this, and very few people talk about this. The reality is that the Trump campaign seized on some of the real and imagined flaws in the voting system. We say that a broken clock is right twice a day, right? So there are sufficient inadequacies in the voting process, in elections administration. There are sufficient flaws in the way elections happen around the country for someone to create doubt. Now, most of the doubts that were spewed by the Trump campaign were very selective. He only selected states where he lost, uh, and they were states that he won that have insufficient funding and resourcing of elections processes. Uh, but I think what happened was the polarization of the country, not just around politics, but just in general, the polarization of the country caused the people who really believed that the President Biden stole the election, the Democrats stole that election. Those people are so adamant about affirming the legitimacy of the victory that they are not interested in discussing the flaws that frankly exist. But to discuss flaws is to feed and accredit the critique coming from those who believe he stole the election. Uh, and I think because we're so polarized on this subject and others, you can't have a civil conversation about anything, about race, about gender, about economics, and about voting and democracy. To have a real conversation about voting and democracy really requires a thorough analysis of how we run elections and how we promote voter education. And unfortunately, to say that, it might even make me sound like I'm a supporter of these conspiracy theories, and I'm not. The fact of the matter is this: unless something's drastically changed, we don't know in our country how many people vote in a presidential election. We don't ask the question. What happens on election day is we vote, and then we count the number of votes for our candidate. But if 1 million people vote, generally only 950,000 votes are counted. And so we know how many people voted for candidate A. We know how many people voted for candidate B, but we don't know how many people voted and their votes weren't counted.
Hmm.
Some people may not have voted for anyone on that level. It's the undervote and the overvote. It's that count because there is no requirement that states report to anyone how many people voted. We don't count voters; we count votes. And because most elections are not that close, it's insignificant.
Well, we're seeing some close ones now, but I guess when you talk about that though, does this very conversation, the fact that there's this feeling, and you're absolutely right, so polarized, I couldn't agree with you more, you really can't talk about much without people running into their camps, if you will, but um does that in itself dissuade people from voting, right? All the work that we do to try and say, hey, come on out, elections, the efforts there, come on out and vote, your vote is important, your vote matters. But then, even when we're having a conversation like this, we say, hey, some votes, what we don't even know which ones aren't looked at. By the way, you're hearing all this messaging. Maybe we, what's the real story? Should we vote? Are those messages contradictory in any way? And how do we encourage people to participate in the process? While kind of having these ancillary discussions around how effective it is or how perfect or not perfect it might be.
Yeah, I think one answer is education. We have inadequate civics education in our schools, and so you can graduate with a high school diploma and not even know what a mayor does or what a council person does. It's always interesting to me when I would travel to Jamaica and other developing countries. I found a much higher level of understanding and passion around their governmental processes. Um, I talk to people every day that don't know the difference between a council person and a congressperson. And so I think it starts with education. We just are underinformed as a society on on voting, on democracy, on elections. I mean, this discussion, quite frankly, I don't think contributes to um, dissuading people from voting because most people don't listen to these kinds of
Mm.
discussions. Most people don't know that. This is 20 years later. Most people never heard us when we said we think the federal government should require every state to send in the totals on how many people vote. People aren't, we're distracted. We're a culture of major distractions, and technology has exacerbated that reality. And so I think education first in public schools and then in the public square. And then I think we need more people like you. We need more platforms like this. We need more conversations, just civil conversations around what reality is and what it could be. But our society and our culture has become very watered down in terms of substance and we're more focused on who wins a Grammy than who wins an election.
Mm. Well, as you're speaking, I can't help but think. I remember having a few conversations, and it often centers around the same theme of community, right? And listening to those in your community and listening to community. But I remember having some debates and discussion around what is community, right? Especially with technology nowadays, social media. What people feel connected to and their sense of community might be very different than what maybe you or I think of community as. But I got to ask you in that capacity. As a senior pastor for 30 years, you had great success, right? Connecting people to community, being part of an educational opportunity, being part of, I'm sure, obviously focus on faith, but engagement, and really having people understand the importance of giving back to being part of the community. How do you see some lessons in that? I guess how do you see some examples from that we could more broadly utilize to really engage people, to make them feel part of our community, whatever that community may be, but a community that understands the importance of elections, understands the importance of voting, understands the impact on their lives, et cetera. How do you draw people back into that community, maybe based on some of the successes that you had?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think about either that question or some derivative almost every day. I grew up in Montclair. It took me years, Sean, to realize that Montclair was not normal. We had we had a black mayor in 1968, 2 years before Newark, with a 27% African American population. We in high school at Montclair High School in 1968. Um, I lost an election because you had to register to vote in student government in Montclair High School. To vote for student council president, you had to vote. You had to register to vote, and most of my friends weren't registered, and I lost. I won I won senior class president because you didn't have to register for that. Um, Montclair had churches. St. Paul's Baptist Church had had a sports basketball program that was bigger than any recreation league that a local government would sponsor. Union Baptist Church built affordable housing down on Glen Ridge Avenue. St. Mark's United Methodist Church had programs and outreach, and all of the churches gave scholarships. So I grew up in this environment where community was concrete, where relationships were definable and measurable and tangible, and where blacks were both Democrats and Republicans. Our mayor was our first black mayor was a Republican, And we had a very strong contingent of Black Republicans, and we also had a very strong contingent of Black Democrats. So that's the environment I grew up in. It took me years to outgrow the thought that was normal. So by the time I get to First Baptist, the church where I served for 30 years, I talked about a community church, a church that served outside of the four walls of the church. But now I'm in a church where 60% of the people drive more than 20 minutes to get to church. I'm in a church where the word community had to be defined because we're on the border of Franklin Township, which is run by Republicans at that time, and New Brunswick, which is run by Democrats, divided by state highway. And so we literally had to spend a number of years just defining what we mean by the neighborhood. What is the neighborhood? We had public housing, we had undocumented immigrants, we had just a mix of people. We also had Black executives at AT&T. We had it was just different than anything I had grown up under. And so we had to. It was a process of defining what is the neighborhood, what is our in the healthcare industry. They started using the term catchment area. What is the scope of our interest? We can't help everybody. We can't save everybody. We can't serve everybody. And so we literally went through a formal process to answer your question: what is our neighborhood, and therefore our community? And I think you have to do that because even on a national level, we have persons who speak for us nationally, and they talk about the Black community. And I want to know, which Black community do you mean? I mean, a third of us are stuck at the bottom of the economic ladder, but about 10% of us are doing quite well. So which Black community are you talking about? And therefore, what solutions are you offering to that community? I think it's why the larger community gets frustrated when we talk about affirmative action, because in their mind, they see a portion of who we are. They don't see the rest of who we are. And they sometimes wonder why we need the solutions that we propose, because they don't see the undercurrent or the underbelly of our reality. So the need to define community by situation is a very, very important need. When I was Secretary of State, we had an Hispanic community in Morris County, and that entire community came from one city in one nation in South America. It was like a direct pipeline from that village in South America to that city in Morris County. And I think we have to be precise enough to see those nuances and then to shape our communications and our solutions to social challenges that precisely.
Well, let's talk about, you mentioned in there the economics of it, right, which is a huge piece. And certainly if you want to define community and certainly helping a community, you got to talk about economics, right? You've got to talk about opportunity there. Maybe just start by saying a little bit about, what D-Free is, right? Because I think that's an important piece for financial freedom movement. So what is that? What's its mission? And then I guess, how does that help to build community, help to improve economic outcomes and opportunities and development in certainly underserved communities? But tell us a little bit about that, maybe.
Sure. I had been at First Baptist for 15 years, and we had done tremendous growth. We had experienced tremendous expansion institutionally. The church had gone from about 800 members when I got there to, by 2005, we probably had 3,000 or 4,000 members. We had 800 members when I'm sorry, we had 800 members when I got there. We grew to about 3,000 or 4,000 members by 2005, and we had built affordable housing. We had built a new sanctuary. We had converted an 80,000 square foot abandoned warehouse into a primary care health facility and partnered with a healthcare institution to provide healthcare to everyone. So the church was doing well. The church was doing well as an institution. But we discovered a couple of things. First, we discovered that after we built 127 units of affordable housing for home ownership, that many of our members and community members, we made no distinction between the two, but many of the folks for whom we built the housing had such poor credit that they couldn't qualify even for the affordable housing. even with the special lending that the banks were prepared to do, that they didn't have sufficient savings for even a 3% down payment on an FHA loan. So we discovered that. We discovered also that many of our middle income and upper middle income members were paying high interest rates. We had a doctor who had who had a credit score in the 700s, who was paying 27% interest on a car loan to drive a late car model car. He qualified for a loan of no more than 4%. We actually formed a credit union. We refinanced his car and cut his car payments in half to drive the same car. So we had these economic realities. The FDIC reported back in 2005 that 54% of Black people were either unbanked or underbanked, 21% no bank account at all, 33% underbanked, which necessarily reflected at least some reality in my congregation. So after 15 years of building a really strong institution, I decided that it was incumbent upon me to really focus on building strong economic families, strong financial families, people who understood money, who handled money, and who had financial goals and then strategies to get there. I in 1973, I went to work for Jesse Jackson. And I went to work for him, one, because I thought he was the heir to the leadership left by Dr. King's death. And I thought Jesse Jackson's message was right. He wasn't focused on politics in the early 70s. He was focused on economics and finances. He kind of strayed from the mission and got involved in politics, and the Rainbow Push coalition came to be. But back in those days, we said the civil rights movement's over. Now we need economic freedom. And economic freedom for me by 2005 did not simply mean, higher wages, even though I believe in a healthy minimum wage. I don't think people should work 40 hours and then not be able to survive in Montclair or anywhere in New Jersey or anywhere in the country. I believe in that. It's not, and more Section 8 vouchers. I believe Section 8 should be a cushion for people when they need it, but not a permanent solution. So I believe in all of these external things. But I also understood by 2005 that within 3 years of retirement, 60% of the professional basketball players were bankrupt. 60%. And in those days, and like in these days, they were making much, much, much more than the minimum wage. So it's a combination of economic justice and personal responsibility. And my own story, when I lived in Montclair, I drove nice cars. I would never drive a car older than 2 years old. Never. No one that knew me in Montclair ever saw me drive an old car. But I was broke. I had no savings. I had no insurance. I had no investments. But I was a community leader. I was a young minister. I was an activist. Gil Noble, who was from Montclair, had me on his TV show. So I had to look like something. So I had nice clothes, nice car, and I was absolutely broke. And I lived that way until my grandmother, when I was 31 years old, died and left me real estate. And it changed the way I thought about my life and changed the way I thought about money. So D-Free focuses on financial freedom. That's where the free comes from. And the D is there good D's and bad D's. I had to get past my bad D's. Debt. I was using credit cards showing back in those days as if they were income. And I was financing this lifestyle I couldn't afford. So debt delinquencies, I was paying PSE&G and other bills late and paying late fees. And deficits, I was living above my means. So I personally had to overcome using debt incorrectly, getting organized to avoid late fees, and then having a budget and living below my income. Those are the bad. So then I was able to start making deposits. I had a bank account. I could earn dividends on investments and own real estate with my name on the deed. So D-Free is a brand that has a curriculum teaching people those principles of a financial lifestyle, setting goals, talking to professionals for help. And we've trained about 5,000 churches and community groups around the country to use our strategy. We're working on getting 100,000 people to pay off $10,000 in debt. And I've just created a new digital platform that people can use their phones to familiarize themselves with financial education. So it's a movement, it's a brand, and it's it's uh, it's what my life has been committed to for the last 18, 19 years.
Well, I can only imagine the impact that that's having. And maybe I'd ask you this, although I do want to go back to, because you mentioned healthcare in there, by the way, which I think is another huge piece of this and what you did at the church. But before that, when you talk about the economics here, and you talk about an example of creating something that can help educate people, right? Let's start there. That's the number one thing, and to get people to focus on the ways they can improve their financial situation. Um, what role would government have? What role do elected officials, right? If I say to somebody, it doesn't matter if I elect this one or that one, or what are they going to change? What difference does it make? What are some ways that you do feel that people in elected positions can, through programs or through individual actions, votes, change some of the things that would make life a little better and provide a little more economic stability and opportunities for growth?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked that because it brings us full circle in terms of closing the loop for democracy. First of all, public policy. Public policy always matters. It is legal in this country today to give a poor person or give anybody a loan and charge them 400 and 500% interest. It's legal. The Consumer Finance Protection Bureau in Washington, D.C., since it was established, has yet to make it illegal to offer payday loans. And the Pew Charitable Trust has researched this, and it said person who takes out a 400, 500, 600% payday loan generally needs 9 more loans to pay off the original loan. So what happens, Sean, is that you take out a $500 loan, you're supposed to pay it back in 2 weeks. They charge you a fee, and 2 weeks later, you pay 50. If you have $500 to pay it back, you pay $500 plus, let's say, a $75 fee. If you don't have the $500, they'll give you another loan, and they charge you the $500, the $75 fee, a second fee, and then a late fee. And by the time you've done that 9 times, they roll them over. You could end up paying $2,500 for a $500 loan. In Birmingham, Alabama, which is one of the real high points of the civil rights movement. Fred Shuttlesworth was there. Dr. King wrote that famous letter from a Birmingham jail in Birmingham, Alabama. You go to Birmingham today, and in one strip mall, there's a cash for gold, check cashing facility, pawn shop, and payday loan store in one strip mall. And there are members of the city council who, when an ordinance was introduced to limit the number of those stores in their city, it was voted down because that industry finances the campaigns for so many politicians. So that's just one example of how elected officials and public policy are relevant for economic justice. And I could go on and cite 100 more examples. So voting matters, public policy matters, and it's not just government putting certain programs in their budgets. It is that, but it's public policy on a federal level. I mean, we saw a housing crisis in 2008 that had 2 willing partners fuel each other's greed, as it were. You had greedy bankers, and you had people who wanted to borrow money they couldn't afford to pay back. And it was a kind of collusion that created chaos, and it was global. So I just think voting is so important because people are in positions to make decisions that have economic impact, but government is never more responsible for me than I am for myself. So it's both and, it's not either or. Conservatives say, we want limited government and let the markets solve the problems and let people be responsible. And then progressives have a tendency to say, government, has the ultimate responsibility. It's the employer of last choice. And I think it's somewhere in the middle that we find the relationship between government and prosperity.
Well, maybe your answer to this is exactly that. You're going to say it lies somewhere in the middle, but in that example, right, when you've got elected officials who are maybe voting against the interests of those who serve, right? When you talk about payday loans, right? That's an example. How do you get through that issue, right? If those individuals, at a local level are still representing, right, still getting elected, I guess it's a where do you kind of break that cycle of dollars going into a campaign to support a position that helps those entities, those institutions, but not the residents, but then those residents are underserved, but then get disenfranchised from voting. And how do you break that cycle there, I guess?
Well, first again, it's education. When I wrote my book, Say Yes to No Debt, my publisher is the largest Christian publisher in the country, owned by one of the largest publishing houses in the world. So it's a substantial. This was not self-published, which means that I wrote the book and they hired a PhD to edit my book. And when the PhD came to the section on payday loans, he wrote me back and said, "You made a mistake." I said, "What's the mistake?" He said, "Well, you say in the book that $100 loan that has a $15 fee is a 390% interest rate." I said, "Well, what do you think it is?" He said, "I think it's 15%." And I told him it would be 15% if you had a year to pay it back. But if if you borrow $100 and the fee is $15 and you have to pay it back in 2 weeks, the APR is 15 times 26, which is 390. So here was a guy who was hired by my publisher to edit my book with a PhD who didn't even understand what APR is. So my point is, there's got to be educate. We have to educate people. Now, in the Black tradition, which I think is not just good for Black people, but I think it's a paradigm for other possibilities. The Black tradition is that in church, when people pack in those churches on Sunday morning, and now they log in on YouTube and Facebook, the preacher has a responsibility to be not only priestly, but prophetic. And so in Montclair, I grew up around preachers like D.C. Rice, who brought Martin Luther King to town and who would preach to his congregation about the issues facing our town. It's funny. We in 1972, I filed a federal grievance against Montclair for not hiring Black firemen. And in those days, we had revenue sharing funds, and the Treasury Department threatened to withhold revenue sharing funds from Montclair because of our complaint. So when I went to meet with the members of the town commission, back in those days, we had commissioners. One commissioner said to me, "Well, what do you want? You want us to have a quota system?" I said, "Sir, all due respect, you have a quota system. You hired one Black fireman in 1952. You hired one Black fireman in 1962. You've hired one Black fireman in 1972. That sounds like a quota to me." But the churches, from the pulpits of our community, not only Black preachers, but Central Baptist Church and the Unitarian Church and Presbyterian Church in Upper Montclair Presbyterian, these clergy came together, and it was a drumbeat for justice. And that's when Montclair began to change. In 1976, there was a campaign where there was a slate of candidates who ran for office on one platform, and that was to end busing for racial integration in Montclair. One. Today, Montclair is the crown jewel of public education, primarily because we established in the 1970s a busing program not around race, but around magnet schools. And the magnet school became the national solution for communities that were at each other's throats because they didn't want busing. Black people didn't want busing necessarily, but they wanted good education. And the way to get good education was to put your child on a bus to go to good school. So Montclair, we said, well, why don't we make all the schools great? Why don't we make Glenfield as good as Mount Hebron? Why don't we make Nishawane as good as Edgemont? And when we did that, then parents from Upper Montclair said, well, I want my child to go to Glenfield in the 4th Ward, and if it takes putting them on a bus, send the bus. So the point is, the churches in Montclair, the pastors, the clergy, all over town, Black and white, preached and educated their congregations, and we came up with the kind of monopoly that you inherited. So that's what we need: education, and then you have to have moral leadership that will lead people to higher ground.
Well, another piece that I guess is so impactful because it's tied directly with economics because healthcare, health challenges can immediately set back a family tremendously, bankrupt someone. You mentioned really tying that in with the work you did at the church specifically. How do you see that piece of it tied in with the economics that we talk about? Healthcare and economics are just constant political issues. I'll put it in that way as well. So it kind of all connects maybe, but what role did you play there? How did you see that benefiting the community as a whole, and maybe tie that into how can that also be a part of that economic stability that's afforded someone through political and policy pieces that get us healthcare systems that work for everybody?
Yeah, well, you're going real deep today, Sean. My mother's youngest brother died in the emergency room at Mountainside Hospital because when he had a heart attack and we took him to the emergency room, no one came out to see him.
I'm sorry.
My mother will not go inside Mountainside Hospital since her brother died there, and is traumatized by all emergency rooms. I now sit on the board of a healthcare system whose commitment is that no one will make more than 15 minutes in an emergency. No one. And it's because of the kind of leadership that our system has and the kind of commitment that the board has to that leadership. Now, having said that, the system operates on about a 1% margin. Almost no one would go into a business where if you brought in if your business brought in $100 a day, you can only keep $1. It's a very fragile business, which means that's where government comes in, because we have, for instance, charity care. We have people who don't have insurance, but they have a right to be treated. And so what government does is government subsidizes, supplements what we get from insurance companies and the like. And so government plays a key role in making sure that healthcare can be available for everyone. Government also has the right to regulate the cost of drugs. My friend from Georgia, Reverend Senator Raphael Warnock, spearheaded an effort to have the federal government put a cap on insulin that can save people's lives. That's policy. So there's funding, and then there are policies. A woman, I just read, I think today in the New York Times, a woman whose husband died left her a big bank account, donated $1 billion to Einstein Medical School in New York to ensure that every student that goes to that school is tuition free.
Yeah, I saw that.
That's the private sector. Do you see that?
Yeah.
Just marvelous. So it's the private sector, the public sector, and community leadership that need to come together to focus on what is the solution. We have 1 million nurse shortage in this country. 1 million nurses. That was before COVID, which means that government policy and private institutions should be looking at third graders now to ensure that 20 years from now we don't have a $2 million nurse shortage. But it takes leadership. Leaders around the country should be coalescing around identifying 2 million prospective third grade nurses and taking them to hospitals and doing pre-nursing at that level. Otherwise, the problems that we have will persist, and without intentionality to aim efforts towards solutions, we will spend a lot of our time discussing solutions and not solving problems. So healthcare is critical. The kind of technology that's used in healthcare now is so expensive that the business model as we know it is going to have to be massaged, managed, and then it's going to have to be transformed into a system that guarantees that all of this financial and economic prosperity that we're pushing for can be realized by people who are healthy. Because the greatest threat to our prosperity is our health.
Well, I'll just say this. I want to just take a moment and note and commend you for bringing like all the pieces together, because I know that, really in the heart of the pandemic, I know that you were played a key role in really having a COVID vaccine clinic that allowed people to, hear from a trusted partner, to make sure they were taking care of their health needs, and certainly, quite frankly, to make it through something that was a very scary time. Still is, obviously, as we kind of come out of it here. But I just want to commend you as to, I know you leveraged a lot of the relationships there to make sure that you took care of the community. So, well done. Just maybe, I guess I have to ask this as we get close to kind of wrapping up, and before I get to, what gives you optimism, right? Because I do always like to say, like, hey, listen, there's a lot there, and as you said, we're just scratching the surface. We could probably talk for another hour or two about a lot of these things. But before I get to that, I mean, here we are. The presidential race is kind of shaping up, it seems, right? It's already at that point where I think everyone, presumes we know who's going to be going head to head again. Well, what are your thoughts on this? Here we are with an election, former president running again. Certainly, we all see the pieces that surround him, and we have our current president, and certainly the talk that we have there. What are your thoughts on that, just in terms of how you see this race shaping up, and what do you think it means for our democracy?
Well, I have personal thoughts that I would never say out loud, and then I have thoughts that are appropriate for public consumption.
Well, for better airing, I might prod you for the ones you can't say, because it sounds like they're juicy. But I'll take what you can. I'll take what you can.
We go back all the way back to the beginning of our conversation. I think it's incumbent upon all of us to work as hard as we can to convince people that it makes sense to vote. I think apathy is probably winning right now the race, and cynicism is probably the second in winning the race. I just think it's important for us, all of us, in whatever positions we have, to convince people that it is important to vote. It's important to vote because so many people went through so much to ensure that we had the right to vote. It's important to vote because it speaks to your willingness to contribute to the kind of country you want the country to be. It's important to vote because it inspires people in places all over the world who look to America to be their moral and cultural example. So it's important to vote, and it's important to vote because every vote counts. Every vote literally counts, and as the country is so divided, one thing about our being so divided is that, as you said earlier, it means that more and more elections are decided by just a handful of votes. So it's important to vote, and I just think that message has to be sent, and that's why, to go to my earlier point, I don't think we can leave it to the politicians and the campaigns themselves to do the work. I mean, both candidates have as their goal getting more votes, and so the turnout for me is the goal. Then the second thing is, I think all of us should know as much as there is to know about the administration of elections in our local county and state districts. Yeah, I grew up in Essex County, and it was always curious to us how the Democrats always had line A. The county clerk, the process was that there would be slips of paper in a jar, and the county clerk would put her hand into the jar and supposedly randomly pick the names, and the names were always, the party always had line A, the Democrats.
Right. Somehow beat those 50-50 odds, or whatever odds, right? They were.
I won't reveal the secret. I learned the secret later on.
Right.
But then in Newark, the voting machines always broke down. In those days, we had lever machines. The voting machines always broke down in the South Ward, the Central Ward, and the West Ward. They never broke down in the North Ward or the East Ward. The East Ward. So my point is that there is enough cynicism based on all kinds of reasons, historical and contemporary reasons that would discourage people from voting. And I just think uh, people should know as much as they can about the process, where the voting machines are stored, who's in charge, do we have enough poll workers to manage an election? Because what happens at the top is completely dependent upon the integrity of what happens on the ground. And that's what a democracy is. Every election district matters. And if people were more educated, I think they'd have more confidence, first of all, and they'd understand that democracy is not just voting, but democracy is contributing to the entire process.
Do you, and you just, and this is, I'll wrap with this, but in your answer there, do I still hear optimism? Are you still optimistic that, we will be successful in engaging voters? We will be successful in getting over that cynicism. We will be successful in getting government and other entities to drive out the vote, as opposed to, try shoot for a win, if you will. Are you optimistic in all these areas? I guess I'd ask.
I'm optimistic because I'm optimistic because I see so many young people who remind me of us, who are passionate about issues, who are active in addressing issues, and who are involved in creating solutions. The activists who protest get much more publicity than the activists who are really doing the work to solve problems. Just 2 days ago, I gave a speech to a group of young people from all over the country, Dallas and Chicago and Atlanta and Los Angeles. Many of these young people are former drug dealers and formerly incarcerated, and they're going back into the neighborhoods, working with other young people, younger people, dissuading them from making bad decisions and choices. You don't see them much in the media, but there are a lot of people doing that work. There's a white woman in South Carolina who was married to a police officer, and her husband was killed by a young black male. And she testified at the young man's hearing trial that had the city gotten to that young man sooner, her husband might be alive. And she's dedicated the rest of her life at building bridges between white cops and black kids and helping black kids make great choices. You don't see her on the news. So I'm optimistic because I know so many young people around this country are doing positive things for positive change. They're not sitting back making excuses. They're not involved in what we call ratchet or decadent behavior. They're trying to build for a better tomorrow. So that's one reason I'm optimistic. The second reason I'm optimistic is because, unlike any other country in the world, this country was founded on principles so lofty that it gives every generation something to work on. We hold these truths to be self-evident. All men and women are created equal and endowed by their creator with these certain inalienable rights, that among these rights are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. These words were written by people who didn't live up to them themselves. But when you have high goals and when you have a passion to achieve those goals, then you always have something to do. You always have something to work on. And so we've been able to come through slavery. We've been able to liberate women from second-class citizenship. We were able to close sweatshops where children were worked like animals. We've been able to get past civil rights. We were able to reconcile concentration camps where Asians were interred. I mean, we've come a long way from where we were, driven by these foundational principles. And every generation that has leaders who are committed to those principles works towards the embodiment themselves and the execution in their work of achieving those principles. And so I'll be optimistic anytime I pledge allegiance to the flag, or quote the Constitution, or even sing lift every voice and sing. Black people started singing Lift Every Voice and Sing while the Ku Klux Klan was still trying to drag us back into slavery. So we have an optimistic culture. We come from an optimistic history. And that's why I'm optimistic about the future.
Well, Reverend, couldn't have said that better and been more inspiring. Thank you so much for that, and thanks for the conversation today. Really, just very interesting, and so much more we could talk about. We might have to do this again because there's a lot
Sure.
there. But as you noted, I think the more we can each do a little bit of our part to educate, to make sure voices are out there, make sure others are learning some of these things, that maybe we can offer a little bit of information that helps them become a little bit more engaged, that they can help someone else. It makes a difference. So thank you so much for all you've done, all you do. And thanks for jumping on today for a conversation.
Thank you. And you keep doing what you're doing.
Thank you, my friend. Appreciate it.